Hello and welcome to another Applying Ethology webinar. I am Laura Whalen, a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, and I've been working with Christian Nararoth, Jenyan Shao, and Rachel Park to organize these webinars. As we begin today, I want to remind you all to please turn off your camera and your microphone. Should you have questions for our speaker, please type them in the chat box and we will get to them at the end of the presentation. Today, it is an honor to welcome my friend and colleague, Benjamin Lecorps. Ben is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia in Canada, where he studies emotions in dairy cattle, particularly during common management practices such as regrouping and disbudding. Today, Ben will be sharing his research on pessimism and optimism in dairy calves. Thank you for being here, Ben.
Thanks, Laura. It's nice to be here too, and thanks for everyone that organized the webinars. Very great events every time. So let me share my screen. Hopefully, you should be able to see it in a few seconds if that works well. Awesome. Can you see the main slide, Laura?
Looks great, Ben.
Awesome. So thank you everyone for being here. It's it's a great pleasure to be presenting in front of all of you, and thanks for taking half an hour or more to listen to what I have to say today. So I thought it would be nice to go back to some of my PhD work, my early PhD work on individual differences. And as Laura said, I tend to focus more on emotions now, but I've also worked a lot on trying to understand the consequences of individual differences for the welfare of dairy calves. So today we're going to talk about optimism and pessimism and the relationship with potential markers of welfare in calves. Okay, so before going to animals, I would like to kind of set the stage by illustrating what we currently know about optimism in humans. This should help highlighting why looking at optimism in animals matters when we care about their welfare. So optimism is defined as the general expectations, either positive or negative, that people form for future outcomes, and is associated with a bunch of quite positive or desirable outcomes. So there's a lot of work in humans showing that it's increasing individuals' capacity to resist stressors, to be resilient to stressor. It's associated with better health outcomes and somehow more satisfying social relationships. So all those things matter for assessing the quality of life of humans, and I think we all agree that these things may matter too for assessing the quality of life of animals. But we don't know much about this, and it's not just about optimism. We don't really understand yet how individual differences in general really promote a better quality of life or favor a poor quality of life for animals. So we try to explore a few things today. So the main objectives of today are to explore whether dairy calves express stable differences in optimism and pessimism, meaning do they form more positive or more negative expectations? And if yes, then are these differences related to how calves respond, perceive, respond, and recover from stressors, and how they behave in their social group? So before going any further, I want to remind everyone that this type of research relies on associations and that they provide limited inferences on causation. So I will try to refrain myself from making clear causation inferences there, but if I do, please understand I'm talking too fast. And even though we have some good reasons to believe pessimism drives X or Y, we do not have proximate proofs of it yet. Okay, so how to assess optimism in dairy calves and more generally in animals. I expect that most of you have heard about the use of judgment bias tests to assess affective states in animals. These tests rely on how animals make decisions when confronted to an ambiguous situation. And most of the times, animals are first trained to associate a cue with a positive outcome. So here, the red stimulus, and a negative outcome with another cue that here would be white. Once learned, animals typically display go responses to the red stimulus and no-go responses to the white stimulus, as illustrated here. So hopefully you should see a calf touching a box on the right and then touching the screen and then collecting a milk reward. So when the screen is red, the calf go, if the screen is white, as you can see, the calf asks for another trial. Red again, touching the screen, collecting the reward. So this was the beautiful work of Heather Neve, one of our colleagues here at UBC, and is now working in New Zealand. And our follow was a beautiful illustration of how calves can learn to make these associations. So, okay, so now that calves know how to differentiate those two stimuli, we need to subject them to ambiguous stimuli intermediate to the two previously learned ones. And for that, for example, we can use the pink stimulus that would be truly ambiguous, would be truly in the middle between red and white. So in this case, if animals go to the pink stimulus, they are deemed optimistic. If they don't go or go slowly to the pink stimulus, then they are deemed pessimistic. So for all experiments I will talk about today, we use kind of a different task, but based exactly on the same idea, using a spatial learning task that is slightly easier for calves to understand. So in this case, calves had to learn that one location here on the left is associated with, so if the bottle is on the left, it means the bottle contains milk. If the bottle is on the far right, it means the bottle is punished, meaning there is no milk and there is an hair dryer being activated if the calf touches it. Once they learn that, they typically display go responses to the left and no go responses to the right. And then we know the trick. We put a bottle in one of the three locations, such as the one that is displayed here. And basically the question for the calf is there milk in this bottle? So let's have a look at a pessimistic approach. As you can see, the calf is clearly seeing the bottle. Not going for now. Nah. Okay, so spoiler alert, she will never touch this bottle. She probably thinks it's too risky. Too close from where she has been punished before and too far from where she has been rewarded before. Okay, let's see another calf. As you can see, we have a very, very different response here. And I want to make it clear, we didn't try to manipulate their mood before the experiment. So these calves were raised in exactly the same way. And what we're looking at right now is the baseline level of optimism or pessimism. Okay, so we basically trained calves for two sessions, one when they were 25 days old and a second one when they were 50 days old. And one key step when looking at judgment bias results is to make sure that animals show a linear progression in their response to the different cues. Here, the latency to touch the bottle increased in a linear way with respect to their location. And there was no effects of session on this response, suggesting that calves did not habituate to the ambiguous cues. For the following analysis, we average calves' responses to all three ambiguous locations here, because we had no specific predictions for any of the specific locations. So we took responses all together. So we use the average latency to calculate a pessimism score for session 1 and for session 2. And here you have displayed the linear relationship between scores in session 1 and score in session 2. As you can see, we have two different graphs here because we trained calves. On the left, it was in 2016, and on the right was in 2018. So two different batches of calves with approximately 60 animals tested over 2 years. And as you can see, we find quite good consistency over time, meaning that some calves persistently made more pessimistic judgments and some other calves made more persistent optimistic judgments. That being said, as you can see, some calves change over time, and reasons for that are currently unknown. So these calves, for example, became much more optimistic in session 2 compared to what they used to be in session 1. But overall, seems to work pretty well. Okay, so it's interesting to note that calves can be consistent over time in their response to judgment bias tests. But for welfare scientists such as ourselves, the true question is how these differences affect calves' quality of life. And the first step for us was to explore whether optimism and pessimism would be associated with different coping styles or different stress reactivity. For doing so, we used a bunch of tests that are designed to assess other personality traits, such as fearfulness, mostly. And on the left, you still have the same videos that I presented before. And on the right, you have the same calves response to a novel object. Let's see if this works. Yeah, it does. Okay, so one thing I want you to focus here is on the right. Seeing how fast these calves will touch the bucket. As you can see on the bottom right, if the videos work, then the bottom right shows the calf touching the bucket already, when on the top right, the calf is still not engaging with it at all. Maybe she will. Not for now. I don't think you will be able to see it for today. So basically the idea here is that the way they approach something that could be considered as ambiguous, like they have no idea if the bucket is associated with something positive or something negative or nothing at all, which kind of is the case here. So it's nice to see that the calf on the right, the top right, the pessimistic one, probably considered that it was a bit risky to touch something that was novel like this. Okay, so fearfulness was actually calculated based on responses to a bunch of different tests and not only the novel object test. And our results show that pessimistic calves seems to be more inclined to adopt an avoidance-based coping strategy, and said in another way that they could be considered as more fearful or more reactive. And when you really think about it, it's not really surprising as the two tasks, meaning the judgment bias test and the novel object test, cannot rely on different forms of ambiguity. So it's great to have this kind of confirmation that it's kind of consistency across context now. But we have only described animals' response to very artificial tests, and results are promising, but validation requires that we use more established or relevant stressors, such as transportation. So transportation is obviously changing for animals. It encompasses a lot of novelty and a lot of human contact, without even mentioning all the environmental factors that can make long transportation extremely challenging for animals. In this case, we have been pretty gentle with our calves. We just transported them in a small trailer for 10 minutes in the beautiful park that surrounds the farm here in Agassiz. As the objective was to assess how calves responded to transportation, we used infrared thermography to assess eye temperature before, during, and after transportation. Our predictions were that more pessimistic calves that are predicted to react more poorly to stressors would have a higher eye temperature. And we also recorded a number of vocalizations during transport, with the assumption that calves vocalizing more would be more stressed, and then more vocalization will be expressed by more pessimistic animals. So let's see if these predictions are met. And as you can see, it worked quite well. On the left, you have the changes in the maximum eye temperature after loading in the trailer. And on the right, you have the number of vocalizations displayed during the 10 minutes of transportation. And as you can see, more pessimistic animals reacted more to transportation and to loading. So suggesting that they are more at risk to poorly respond to a stressor such as transportation. Of course, we need more data on other stressors to be able to make more generalize these results to other situations. All right, so a more recent part of our work has been focusing on pain, and especially the affective experience of pain. Even though modern conceptions of animal welfare aim at minimizing pain and suffering, farm animals are still subjected to a lot of painful procedures during their lifetime. There is surprisingly an almost complete lack of knowledge on whether some animals cope better than others with response to pain. And this is quite surprising, considering that we as humans differ substantially from one person to the other when in pain. As illustrated in this called, what's the name of this task? I don't remember. But basically, those two persons were asked to put their hand in very cold water and to keep it for as long as possible. So as you can see, there are huge differences between these two people, these two persons, and it's very well known that some people are very highly tolerant to pain and some are not at all. And these differences can involve any components of the pain response, coming from nociceptors sensitivity to more psychological or cognitive processes. And guess what? Optimism has been shown as being one of the best predictors of higher pain tolerance, but also of better pain recovery. So this can be due to a variety of different mechanisms, but we wanted to explore if this was kind of true for dairy calves too. So when we talk about pain in dairy cows, 99% of the time we mean hot iron disbudding. Here's an example of what we are talking about. It's quite visual, so it's quite graphic. So if you don't want to watch, just suggest to look elsewhere for like half a minute, starting now. So probably most of the calves in the world are actually disbudded without pain mitigation, and it looks like this. So hot iron is applied to the hornbird area, and as you can see, the calf is trained to escape the stimulus. This is a good indicator that it feels pain. Fortunately, and for the people that didn't want to watch, they can now. We can control the operative pain. So this calf has received a lidocaine block, meaning that there is no transmission anymore between the nerves on the hornbird area and the central nervous system. So this allows to completely eliminate the pain during the procedure. So for all calves I'm going to talk about today, they were disbudded using a lidocaine block, so a local block, and also were sedated to prevent any effects of stress or fear and so on due to handling. So although we can control the operative pain, we still have a lack of understanding of the post-operative pain, and especially how calves differ in their response to this. So we could have used a bunch of different methodologies to assess post-operative pain, such as wound-directed behaviors, cortisol increase, and so on. But these measures kind of lack specificity and do not really provide much information about what animals experience at the affective level, which is what we are interested in here. So one way to assess mood-related changes associated with pain is to look at anhedonia. So anhedonia has been defined as a reduced capacity to experience pleasure and has been mostly assessed using a reduced consumption or preference for a sweet solution. So here you have an example in rats where animals being stressed display a reduced preference for the sweet solution, compared to the control group that did not change over time. So we tried to apply the same idea, and fortunately it seems that calves spontaneously like a sweet solution. So you can see here that she doesn't seem to complain to be given some sweet stuff. And so for this study, we modified one of the feeders. So it's the blue bin you can see in the picture, and that is in front of the group pen. So the blue bin is given free access to the sweet solution for 6 hours every day. And of course, we recorded before and after disbudding and compared the intakes at that time. So what we expected is to see a decrease in sweet solution consumption after disbudding and a return to baseline after a few days. For the sake of time today, I would just speak about disbudding day and won't mention what happens in the following days. But you can, of course, go to the publication if you want more details on both the methods and the other results. So here you have the change in sweet solution consumption on the day of disbudding. As you can see, most of the calves change compared to their baseline, which was calculated with the previous days, and with a median change around 50%. So most of the calves change, but still there is a tremendous differences. There are tremendous differences, between individuals. And if our prediction is correct, then animals that were more pessimistic should be the ones that show a higher decrease in sweet solution intake, meaning the ones that are on the bottom of this graph. And there should be a negative relationship between changes in sweet solution consumption and pessimism. And that's exactly what we found, actually, although it's of course not perfect. But what you can see is that animals that were more pessimistic, so more on the right side of this graph, had a higher decrease in the sweet solution intake, like represented as proportions. All right, so this suggests that calves first of all, display great differences in how they cope with pain, and that some of them, the more pessimistic ones, seem to be more vulnerable to it. Of course, and again, we need more results and more data and more studies to confirm those results. But it's one of the first studies that actually tried to look at this relationship in animals. So pretty happy about it, actually. Anyway, to end on a more positive note, we also explored how these differences may relate to social behaviors. So far, most of the work on this question has focused on whether submissive animals display lower mood, and thus, they would be more pessimistic in their judgment bias, probably because they are typically subjected to more agonistic behaviors and suffer from higher social competition. So, however, for today, I think it would be great to have another approach, and to consider how they may form expectations about their social relationship in the same way as they make expectations about a novel object or an ambiguous bottle, an ambiguous cue. So if the negative expectations pessimistic animals form extend to social relationships, as shown in humans, then this should affect the quantity and the quality of the social relationships these animals display. Said in another way, if these calves expect bad things to happen, they may not be inclined to engage in as many social interactions as more optimistic individuals. So, to explore this question, we used a few proxies that could give us some information about how calves perceive their social world. We first used two proxies of sociability based on first standardized tests that I kind of mentioned before, such as the runway test. These tests actually assess the way calves respond to social isolation, either by looking at their motivation to join the herd or by looking at how many vocalizations, how much they vocalize when in isolation, probably in an attempt to keep contact with the group. Another thing we looked at is social proximity. So as you can see here, we have three calves that are all together, resting all together, and a calf that is a bit aside. So when looking at social proximity, all those three calves have two neighbors, and the one on the right has no neighbors. So there are good good data. I don't remember in what species, but we have good reasons to believe that social proximity is related to sociability. And coming from our results, we know that actually the two correlate. But we wanted to use these two as a measure of how much, or the quantitative measure of sociability for these calves, versus something that is a bit more qualitative, a little bit more related to how calves perceive their relationship with the different individuals. So basically how selective they are when they distribute the social interactions, with whom they want to spend time, said in another way. So looking first on the relationship with sociability, what we can see here is that there are none. It's not clear that it's not because you're more pessimistic or more optimistic that you are more or less sociable, or vice versa, at least for our results. And it's like optimism did not drive at all the number of neighbors or the number of social interactions as described by proximity scores in the home pen. So no relationship in a quantitative aspect here. However, it seems to be related to how socially selective calves are, meaning that, so here on the y-axis, just to give a little bit more information, is that we have higher score mean that calves were highly selective. They tended to be mostly with a few other calves, and the ones that have a low selectivity score, such as the optimistic animals here, tended to equally distribute their social relationship with one another. So as you can see, pessimistic calves were much more selective, both when they were lying and when they were standing. All right, so just a take-home messages slide. What I want you to keep from today is that it seems that calves make consistently differ in how optimistic or pessimistic they are, with some calves displaying persistent pessimism. And also that these differences are related to coping strategies, response to stressors, probably vulnerability to pain, and also some aspects of their social relationship or social behaviors. Just want to finish this talk by giving you a sense of what are, in my opinion, the outstanding questions we are still far from answering from this research. So one of them, and that bothered me quite a lot, is the lack of understanding of why animals are pessimistic in the first place, or optimistic. As you can see, or maybe you noted, that this research has been conducted in very young animals. Some of them were just first session, 25 days old, and already experiencing some high levels of pessimism. So we know that optimism and pessimism it's generally poorly heritable. So we are not denying that there's probably an aspect related to genetics there, but it's probably not explaining everything. So these differences must come from somewhere, but so far we don't really understand from where. It's possible that early life experiences are actually driven these differences, but as I said before, these cats were kind of raised in the same way. So there's a lot of things to explore on this. And also I want to make it clear that optimism it's probably not always good. From this talk, you may easily leave thinking, yes, it is better to be optimistic. But I want you to keep in mind that we tested hypotheses where we had predictions pessimism would be worse, right? Or that pessimistic individuals would cope more poorly with the different situations. And I really don't think being optimistic is always better. It may provide some benefits, especially for animals raised in captivity, but there are some situations where we can expect optimistic animals do not cope very well, especially if the high expectations are never met. So they, in my opinion, they're probably very susceptible to frustration-induced negative affective states. Anyway, I hope this research will be continuing. And thank you for listening to me. Thank you for all the organizers of the Slack webinar. Again, very happy to be a part of it. And thanks to everyone that was involved in this research.
Brilliant job, Ben. A beautiful presentation. There's already some questions coming in, and since I've asked you plenty of questions in our time together, I will go straight to those. So Abby says, interesting work. I'm curious if we know whether rodents and calves have a similar dopamine response to sugar consumption as humans. If so, wouldn't we expect more depressed and painful calves to increase the consumption of the sugar solution, using it as a sort of coping mechanism?
So it's a very cool question. Obviously, we don't know much about that. It is tricky. It's possible that that something that makes you feel good can be used to cope with a painful stimulus or stressful situation. But most of the research so far has shown decrease in pleasurable activities associated with stressors or pain. So much more evidence that these stressors induce anhedonia rather than increase the use or the consumption of pleasurable resources. But there's definitely a lot. It's not as simple as it may look. And of course, it's interesting to think about how things can go counterintuitively, of course. Yeah, good question.
Sarah says, thank you for this interesting work and talk. What was your learning criterion for the judgment bias task? Was it based on latencies or choices, as in go and no-go responses? If it was based on latencies, how did you deal with the calves first going to the positive location before considering whether or not to go to the ambiguous location, as we could see in both of the video clips?
Yeah, no, it's so there's a bunch of different questions there. I would just answer. I will start with the last one. This is obviously a limitation of the special learning task. I've never seen how pigs deal with that, or dogs, but I assume it's the same. Like they tend to visit the location where they were rewarded first, and then we'll look if there is something else. Calves keep doing that, but as you could see in the video, they tend to look very fast if there is another bottle available in order to make another decision. But it's definitely a limitation of this task. The good thing, though, is that this type of task does not really, it allows us to test every calf, more or less. We didn't have much exclusion, or exclusion, actually 100% of the exclusions we got, meaning 3 calves, I think, were due to health issues and not related to the task itself. So it's very easy for calves to learn this task. Very, very easy. And the different criterions we used, it was based on go, no go, meaning that calves had to be, if I remember correctly, they had to go for 2 days in a row. They had to make no mistakes with going to the negative side. So basically always going to the rewarded side, never going to the negative side for 2 days, 2 consecutive days. And I think it was like 10 testing per day or something like this. I don't know if I will answer all the question. I think I did, but happy to answer more.
Yeah, so just to summarize, you had the training where they were always, the bottle was either on the left or the right, and they knew which was positive, which was negative. And then within the test, the bottle would be either the left or the right or an ambiguous spot. And so the calf would have probably some expectation just from the training that, oh, I should go to the positive side.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Katrina says, hi, Benjamin. Thank you for the interesting talk. I have 2 questions. 1, how many calves did you use for your disbudding and social interaction research? And 2, do you have also any data on calf ability to cope with weaning? If yes, what did you find? If no, would you expect more optimistic individuals to cope with this stress better?
Okay, cool questions too. So for this budding, we had 18 animals, I think. We aimed for 20, but 2 or 3 didn't drink the sweet solution at all. I mean, can maybe correct me if I'm wrong. For the social interactions we were having, it was the first population. So either we used the 3 groups on the 2. I think it was more or less the same number, around 20. And data on weaning, I love to. It's and we have almost all the design. And I think like my predictions would be that optimistic animals would not cope very well with weaning, probably because I could picture a calf that is very optimistic, keeping coming to the feeder, even though it's not providing milk anymore. And it's probably not a good way of dealing with weaning. It's probably better to be upset a little and then move on. So I'm wondering what these calves would do. I haven't been able to collect data on this so far, maybe in the future. But if there's definitely it would be a good example, I think. If I was to bet on one example to show that optimism is not always great, I would go for winning.
Yeah, and at least from Heather Neve's work and all of the people that helped with her, the individual differences, the confident calves are the ones that keep going back for milk.
Yeah, and the exploratory ones too.
Yeah. Camille says, thank you very much for this great and interesting talk. To follow up your thoughts, I guess gestation, the mother cow experience, might have an impact on the level of optimism of the calf. Do you know whether the optimistic and pessimistic calves had physiological hormonal differences? Thank you.
No, I've no idea about that. We haven't explored this question. It's highly relevant, I think. We are very mainly a behavioral group, so we haven't done physiological assessment there. But definitely, I agree. Like it can be coming from early experiences, postnatal early experiences, but also what happens before. So, there are some very cool results showing that submissive cows tend to cope very poorly with the drying off period, and this may affect the success of the calf or the performance of the calf later on. And that makes sense with all we know about gestation stress, right? And how that may affect the future baby. So this is highly relevant for future research, definitely.
Beata says, great to see a variety of tests correlating with calf type. In the red versus white screen, the go and no-go test, how do we know if pink is really an intermediate for the calves and not just another presence of color, red or pink, versus absent of color, white? Do we know how they perceive these colors and contrasts?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I didn't like using color discrimination tasks. So when I chose to go for special learning tasks, I was also a bit worried that I didn't know what these calves were actually seeing in terms of colors. But from Heather's work, it seems pretty obvious that they are very good at distinguishing the two colors or the three colors, especially because Heather used three different colors, not only the middle one that I showed, but also two that were more or less red or more or less white. And if I remember correctly, she had the same linear progression in the response, the calves response, as I got with the special learning task. So it's good evidence that the calves were able to discriminate the different colors.
From Alex, thank you for the talk, Ben. I had two related questions. One, were the calves tested while housed in groups or while still individually housed? And two, if they were in groups, did you notice a trend regarding the numbers of optimistic and pessimistic calves per group pen? For example, could perhaps optimism or pessimism be contagious amongst calves?
That's an interesting question, Alex. So first, yeah, they were all housed in a group, so no individual housing for these experiments at least. And we started training when they were in group house. I don't think I haven't noticed an optimistic trend for a group and a pessimistic trend for another group. The two calves I've showed, the two calves were that I've shown today were coming for the same group. We're actually, I think, born on the same day too, or some very close dates. So I'm not sure that is the case. That being said, the three optimistic calves, the three calves that didn't seem to be the same on session 2 compared to session 1 were on the same group. And I definitely remember with Emily thinking that, oh, that's weird. Those calves really changed. There's something going on there. So maybe something happened at this time that we couldn't control for, that affected the overall group. And my feeling was that was the start of the spring. So I don't know if that's the calves reacted the same way as we did about seeing some sunlight finally again, but maybe it is. I don't know. Would be nice to actually have a look at this, how if some optimism is shared with other animals.
Going back to those three calves that kind of changed their score, was that the only example where you had calves change? Because you've looked at optimism and pessimism in quite a lot of different groups now.
Mm-hmm. We have had, I think the others, the ones that are in the other side of the regression line, the ones that became more pessimistic, I was a bit concerned. They were kind of subclinical sick. I couldn't be sure, and I think I got the same feeling, is that sometimes calves don't feel very well, although they don't have fever, coughing, or diarrhea, but they seem to not be very engaged, or not as easier to engage. So I've always thought that maybe there are some pain involved with whatever, the rumen development or something like this, that could justify why these calves don't seem to look well, although they're not sick, or at least not clinically sick.
Very interesting. Another question from Katrina. Was there any difference between heifers and bulls and their optimism and pessimism, or did you use only one gender? Thank you.
Yeah, only heifers in these studies. We used bulls for another study, and but it was not concomitantly to heifers, so I'm not sure we can make any inferences in there. It's just a little easier, I think, to train bulls. Generally speaking, they're a little bit more obsessed with milk. But yeah, no, I couldn't answer this question. It was challenging with bulls too at some point. If you want more information about bulls, I would suggest to contact Emily Nog, that is here too. That she did a study on judgment bias and castration. So she'd probably be able to answer a few of these questions.
I have a question for you. So pessimistic animals seem to show more of a stress response, for lack of a better phrase, to new events. So the object test and the transport that you showed. What are ways we can make environments more friendly to these pessimistic animals, or just making environments so that animals that are identifying as optimistic and pessimistic, the environment can encompass both of those?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's almost impossible to design an environment where all individuals would cope. Probably the best answer to that would be to give animals the opportunity to express choices and preferences, so that they would kind of use the environment differently according to their profiles and what is best for them. It's of course impossible to have an environment which is stress-free, but they are definitely subjected to way too many stressors. So reducing the stressors would probably help first, and then giving them more choices and more preferences, more opportunity to express choices and preferences would be my guess. And that's the best way, I think. Maybe not, but I think.
Well, it looks like we have gone through all of the questions, really good questions, and thank you so much for your discussion, Ben. So I will stop the recording now, but if people want to stay around, they're welcome to do so.